Welcome to On What Slender Threads. This is Tradition 10. My name is Lynn. This presentation is based on a book that I wrote, On What Slender Threads, AA's 12 Traditions from a Historical Perspective. However, it's not necessary to buy the book unless you'd like to have it as a resource. It is my hope that these video presentations will highlight what I learned from studying research on AA's early history, from the literature available at the General Service Office of Alcoholics Anonymous, and from the experiences and insights of AA friends around the world. I am not a spokesperson for AA. Any inferences in this study are strictly my own and in no way reflect the opinion of Alcoholics Anonymous. I hope it will be helpful. Well, after examining Bill's essays from a historical perspective on Traditions 1 through 9, and if you have listened to those presentations, I know that you know I am convinced that the 12 points to assure our future were peddled to the groups as guidelines that Bill's proposed conference of delegates from AA groups would follow. In Traditions 1 through 9, the structure of our society has been hammered out. Now all we need are a few more principles to ensure our survival. Tradition 10 keeps us from destroying ourselves from within. So an appropriate preamble for this tradition is: never talk down to an alcoholic from any moral or spiritual hilltop. Simply lay out the kit of spiritual tools for his inspection. Offer him friendship and fellowship. From page 95 in Alcoholics Anonymous. And then a third step promise. Established on such a footing, we became less and less interested in ourselves, our little plans and designs. From page 63 of Alcoholics Anonymous. So, Tradition 10. Alcoholics Anonymous has no opinion on outside issues. Hence, the AA name ought never be drawn into public controversy. The original point says that no AA group or member should ever in such a way as to implicate AA express any opinion on outside controversial issues, particularly those of politics, alcohol reform, or sectarian religion. The Alcoholics Anonymous groups oppose no one concerning such matters. They can express no views whatever. Well, let's look at some of the highlights in Bill's essay on Tradition 10. He waxes poetically about how AA has not been divided by major controversial issues, but the important point he's trying to make is to watch our pride. This, however, has been no earned virtue. He is assuring all of us that as long as we don't argue these matters privately, it's a cinch we never shall publicly. And he says, as by some deep instinct, we AAs have known from the very beginning that we must never, no matter what the provocation, publicly take sides in any fight, even a worthy one. He talks about how difficult the world was when AA was first starting. And he says that is the spiritual climate in which AA was born and by God's grace has nevertheless flourished. He talks about AA as a whole. For AA as a whole, we do not enter public controversy. And since recovery from alcoholism is life itself, it's imperative that we preserve in full strength our means of survival. He talks a little bit about the early days and said that AA at one time looked like one prodigious squabble than anything else, at least on the surface. He talks about how elders temporarily turned Pharisee and people would run off and start new groups. But despite their din, our puny rows never did AA a particle of harm. They were just a part and parcel of learning to work and live together. They were almost always concerned with ways to make AA more effective, how to do the most good for most alcoholics. And then Bill starts to talk about the Washingtonian Society. It seemed that they had almost discovered the answer to alcoholism. but unfortunately they allowed politicians and reformers, both alcoholic and non-alcoholic, to use the society for their own purposes, and within a very few years they had completely lost their effectiveness in helping alcoholics. He said, as we surveyed the wreck of that movement, early AA members resolved to keep our society out of public controversy. Now, notice the original form is much more directive and specifically speaks to AA groups. He says, concerning such matters, they can express no views whatever. That, in and of itself, makes it clear that outside opinions contaminate the solution. The original form's explicit charge to AA members. The sixth tradition states AA members ought never endorse, finance, or lend the AA name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. The 10th point, to assure our future, says no AA group or member should ever in such a way as to implicate AA express any opinion on outside controversial issues, particularly those of politics, alcohol reform, or sectarian religion. Similar in spirit, both ask AA groups and individual members to avoid using the name of AA while supporting or while not supporting outside entities or causes. However, the original form of the 10th tradition reminds members that there are more nuanced ways of associating AA with outside causes. In very clear terms, it says no AA group member should ever, in such a way as to implicate AA, express any opinion on outside controversial issues. The phrase, as to implicate AA, requires members to be sensitive to where and when they are expressing their personal opinions on politics, religion, medicine, addiction, treatment, or any subject that might deter a newcomer or divert the group from carrying its message. Even when AA is at best praised or at worst maligned, the practice of this tradition is to have no opinion on outside opinions of AA. Well, how in the world did we get to this point? Recall, the big book had only been out a couple of years when war broke out. And it turned out that AA members had an opinion on World War II. By December 1941, the membership had mushroomed to 8,000 members. Remember, the book came out in 1939. At the same time, the Japanese Imperial Fleet attacked Pearl Harbor, thus thrusting the formerly isolationist United States into war. The United States was at war when what Bill called the big test of AA's unity began in earnest. With his brief experience as a soldier near the end of World War I, it seems that Bill never considered that his support for World War II might be problematic. Bill repeatedly tried to enlist and was rejected. He was in terrible physical health still. The Army also rejected his overtures to provide alcoholic counseling. So Bill's only choice was to help alcoholics at home. Bill and Dr. Bob pursued a number of initiatives during that time that included securing gas rations to be able to take alcoholics to meetings, answering multiple inquiries from newly sober soldiers stationed overseas. Bobby B. tirelessly wrote these soldiers. The Grapevine was actually started to share news from home to the soldiers fighting overseas. The publishing company shifted to a cheaper paper, helping to conserve resources for the war. And Bill went around the country telling groups that they needed to be prepared for a bumper crop of drunks when the war was over. Well, other than Bill's attempt to establish what was tantamount to an AA office in the U.S. Army, his and Bobby's efforts were reasonably aligned with 12-step work, or at least making 12-step work possible. But the problem was other AA groups. A more obvious overreach occurred through several groups' distribution of an AA's pledge for national defense and self-preservation. As a gesture of supporting the nation at war, members were encouraged to take a pledge affirming their loyalty to the United States with a promise to be productive citizens actively engaged in politics. Of course, this loyalty initiative prompted various newspapers to report that Alcoholics Anonymous pledged its support for the duration of the war. That wasn't exactly what happened. At the end of the day, about 300 alcoholics served in World War II, and they received Bill's warm acknowledgement in his third step essay. But overall, with no traditions in existence, AA did manage to avoid a formal stance in the war. AA groups was another matter. Now, as I mentioned in the last presentation, warring countries meet at the World Services meeting held twice a year. Their wars and conflicts are never mentioned. They talk only about AA in their countries. So I asked, with Tradition 6, why was this tradition particularly necessary? For me, it helped to think about Tradition 10 from two levels, two perspectives. Just like Bill chose to have two separate traditions on anonymity, Tradition 11 addressed AA's policy of anonymity at the public level, and Tradition 12 spoke to the spiritual principle of anonymity at the personal level. To understand Tradition 10, it helps to examine opinions on outside issues at the public level and opinions on outside issues at the personal level. At the personal level, to be certain, opinions are a dubious luxury. While Bill never meant for the beginning of There Is a Solution to have a cautionary tone, members might keep the following in mind before broaching outside issues in an AA meeting. He said there that all sections of this country and many of its occupations are represented, as well as many political, economic, social, and religious backgrounds. We are people who normally would not mix. By itself, that observation is a compelling reason for why members should not discuss their personal opinions on outside issues when they gather as a fellowship. A restatement of the tradition might be, we don't agree on much, but we do agree that we have a common solution to the problem of alcoholism. Bill anticipated alcoholics' rebellious nature, particularly with respect to personal opinions, when he wrote of AA in his essay on the first tradition about every individual has the right to think and do as he pleases. However, when members in groups avoid outside issues, they stand a better chance of successfully carrying the message of recovery to many sufferers. They are In the first tradition essay, it goes on to say, alcoholics learn that the clamors of desires and ambitions within them must be silenced whenever these could damage the group. Finally, AA's primary purpose to carry the message is the most important reason to adhere to Tradition 10, so that all who enter are assured of a place that addresses only problems as they relate to alcohol. The place can certainly occur in the meeting before the meeting or the meeting after the meeting. It helps to be somewhat mindful. Bill tried to avoid outside issues when writing the big book. To avoid any controversy that would hinder the acceptance of the book, Bill made a concerted effort not to offend religion, medicine, and other professions. When he wrote the big book, And There Is a Solution, he wrote, of necessity, there will have to be discussion of matters medical, psychiatric, social, and religious. We are aware that these matters are, from their very nature, controversial. Nothing would please us so much as to write a book which would contain no basis for contention or argument. We shall do our utmost to achieve that ideal. And Bill did share drafts of the book with doctors, with therapists, with religious leaders, and he asked, is there anything in here that you think would deter people from coming into the program? One could say, though, that Bill was moderately successful in the medical field, but not very successful in the area of religion. Let's start with medicine. At the public level, medical opinions about alcoholism. Now, whether Bill was aware of it or not, the Emmanuel approach and earlier recovery venture fell prey to medical controversy. The Emmanuel movement was started by Dr. Elwood Worcester for treating assorted forms of nervousness. Courtney Baylor expanded the treatment to include alcoholics in 1913. Besides alcoholics sharing their experiences with each other, which was not an idea newly discovered in AA, it had been used before, the techniques in the Emmanuel movement included hypnosis. Now, Worcester had supporters who were medical professionals, but the movement could not withstand fallout from Freud's and other doctors' competing views within the medical profession. In the first edition of the Big Book, Dr. Silkworth wrote a glowing endorsement of the program, but he did not sign his name in that first edition for fear of censure from his colleagues, maybe. Now, if that were the case, if that was what he was worried about, his professionally protective instincts were borne out by a less than lukewarm AMA review in the October 1939 publication of AMA that said that the only good thing about the book was the recognition of the seriousness of addiction to alcohol, and that the book had no scientific merit or interest. With the help of Dr. Harry Tebow, the medical profession did eventually acknowledge the substantive merit of AA as early as 1943. By then, because of the volume of cells, Bill received multiple invitations to speak at medical societies. Thus, Dr. Silkworth did witness an uneven but progressive acceptance of AA by his own profession. Unfortunately, Dr. Silkworth died about 5 months before AA received the Lasker Award presented in October 1951 by the American Public Health Association. 4 years later, the late Dr. Silkworth's name appeared at the end of the doctor's opinion in the first printing of the second edition in 1955. Now, Dr. Silkworth might not have put his name in the first edition because of his association with Towns Hospital. They did not want the movement to be associated with the hospital. But regardless, Bill had the medical profession's attention with the astounding success of the Big Book, and he professed no credentials except that of being a recovered alcoholic. He was not trying to compete with the medical profession. According to Ernest Kurtz, Bill did not attempt to provide a clinical definition of alcoholism in the book. Kurtz wrote that when biochemists and psychiatrists eliminated the use of physical allergy and mental obsession, this had no effect on the efficacy of a book written by alcoholics who posed no medical theories about alcoholism. Bill skirted opinions on the medical view of alcoholism by eloquently describing the manifestations of alcoholism as informed by his own experience and the experiences of other early members. And he also used the experiences as drawn from the 1931 publication, The Common Sense of Drinking, by Richard Peabody, a former patient of Baylor and the Emmanuel approach. Most importantly, Bill described the thinking of the alcoholic. As Ernest Kurtz pointed out, Alcoholics Anonymous thus offered a concept of the alcoholic rather than an understanding of alcoholism. Avoiding outside issues did not result in immediate benefits, but over time it did save Alcoholics Anonymous from wholesale censure from the medical community. Such is the reward when AA members avoid opinions on medically related topics, and by the same token, avoid giving medical advice at the personal level. Medical opinions at the personal level mean don't practice medicine. The AA group pamphlet has a section on what AA does not do and provides a reminder in that list that AA members do not make medical or psychological diagnoses or prognoses. Other helpful pamphlets include the AA member medications and other drugs, and AA for alcoholics with mental health issues and for their sponsors. Both contain the reminder that no AA member should play doctor. All medical advice and treatment should come from a qualified physician. Well, unfortunately, uninformed diagnoses by AA members have resulted in tragic consequences, sometimes deadly. Now, members can avoid contributing to such harm by carefully following AA's 10th tradition with respect to their own opinions in the area of medicine. Well, let's talk about the public level and opinions about AA and religion. Almost as soon as Bill published the Big Book, it was clear that claiming non-association with religion was not convincing. The first Akron meetings and Bill's repeated religious references probably contributed to a tepid AMA review that also likened the program to the godlike guidance of the Oxford group. Furthermore, the fellowship's own supporter, Dr. Tebow, reinforced AA's religiosity when he described AA as a therapeutic program which includes a definite religious element in his 1944 paper in the American Journal of Psychiatry. And finally, as we said, Bill's own religious experiences and leanings continued to be evident when he wrote the 12 Steps and the 12 Traditions. As a result, AA's early history, its basic literature, and public opinions about the religiosity of AA contributed to the misperception that it was a religious organization. This misperception persists today with the added element of some AA members and groups promoting their own religion in meetings. Thus, public opinions about the religiosity of AA, particularly on the internet or social media, continue to vary wildly. Now, a good example of this variation is in court rulings involving AA. There are many instances in which AA was involved in court rulings, but I'll select two that were interesting. A New York State of Appeals court, Griffin versus Coughlin, concluded that AA engages in religious activity and religious proselytization. The judges who made the ruling focused on the multiple Christian references throughout the Big Book and the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. They ruled that state prison officials could not force prisoners to attend its meetings. In contrast, in another state, Kansas, Stafford versus Harrison court case resulted in the court concluding that AA could not be designated as a religion. It was noted, reading the same literature, the Big Book and the 12 and 12, the definition of a higher power is expressly left to the individual in AA texts, and that the terms spiritual experience and spiritual awakening are broadly defined to include a spectrum of experiences that transform individual behavior. So clearly, judgments about the religiosity of AA depends on who's interpreting our literature. Now, in the Griffin versus Coughlin decision, the New York case, that was appealed, but then the decision prevailed. According to an article in the New York Times, the judge did write on behalf of the majority and acknowledged that they had no intention of denigrating the Alcoholics Anonymous approach through fighting addiction, nor, the decision said, should the prison system scrap drug and alcohol abuse treatment programs if they are offered voluntarily. As it happens, when such controversies occur, reporters sought comments from AA. After all, headquarters lived in New York. Even though the Griffin versus Coughlin decision in effect classified AA as a religious organization in the home state of New York, the New York Times reporter wrote, Alcoholics Anonymous would not say whether it saw itself as a religious organization. An AA spokeswoman said AA has always refrained from commenting on outside issues. At the end of the day, AA's literature is subject to interpretation, and AA's Big Book and 12 Steps and 12 Traditions provide fertile ground for a wide range of opinions and judgments about AA's affiliation or non-affiliation with religion. But per the 10th tradition, AA has no opinion on these opinions. And yet, the problem arises in meetings and media for the General Service Board, enough that they issue a reminder every 2 or 3 years that AA is not a religious organization. Those who are confused might listen carefully to the preamble or refer to one of AA's many written resources, such as the pamphlet, The God Word, Agnostic and Atheist Members in AA, which clearly states that AA is not a religious organization. At the personal level, opinions about religion in AA. Now, AA groups are autonomous according to Bill's essay on the 4th tradition. However, he added a caution that a group ought not affiliate itself with anything or anybody, and Bill used religion as a specific example. He said there would be real danger should we commence to call some groups Catholic or Protestant. Well, the 10th tradition reminds individual members then to share only their own spiritual experience without implicating AA. And by not including any opinions, positive or negative, or denigratingly humorous about religious or non-religious beliefs. It's popular to say that I am a recovering, name that religion. But be aware that there are recovering alcoholics in the room that come from that same name that religion. And we should be sensitive to our differences in our way of following the spiritual path. Well, Alcoholics Anonymous also had to grapple with personal opinions about drugs. In autumn of 1945, Bill's concern increased when the AA Grapevine published 2 stories, Evidence on the Sleeping Pill Menace and Those Goofballs. There was at that time a growing sentiment inside and outside the fellowship to include chemical substances in its program and to expand the fellowship to take in all who were addicted to those substances. But by that time, Bill was formulating the 12 points and had enough experience to know that including other addictions would only dilute the program's primary purpose. Ernest Kurtz wrote in his ever so understated way, Alcoholics Anonymous itself, faithful to its traditions, remained aloof. Generously, the fellowship shared its ideas and literature with any who found them helpful. I do so love the word aloof. It means to be cool and distant. I'm not sure if it's the same thing as detaching with love, but you get the idea. Public and personal opinions were the undoing of the Washingtonians, as Bill had mentioned in his essay. He had only learned about the Washingtonians shortly before he penned the essays in the 12 points. He offered his first thoughts about the group in August 1945 issue of the Grapevine. Kurtz wrote that Bill concluded his article with the exhortation, "May we always be willing to learn from experience." Now, Kurtz noted the irony of this statement, since it was clear that over the following 25 years, AA's ability to learn from the experience of others as well as from its own development was tested. While the members of the fellowship experienced some stumbles with the 10th tradition, the trustees, headquarters, and Bill also put it to the test. Publicly protecting AA's reputation became an outside issue in Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age, as described by Bill. Bill reflected in that volume on a period when in AA when outside entities were using its name in controversial money-making enterprises. The fear of how these endeavors could negatively affect AA prompted the trustees to seek legal recourse. However, it was clear the mass of technicalities, red tape, and charters quickly disrupted their plans. Later, the trustees found out about a film coming up called Mr. and Miss Anonymous, and they felt that it was in very poor taste. Imagine that, a film about alcoholics and very poor taste. Well, mild protestations produced only a change in the title, but not much else. So, headquarters then threatened an injunction, which caused the company to revise its script. The film was distributed as Something to Live For with Joan Fontaine, Ray Milland, and Teresa Wright. In retrospect, Bill acknowledged that the trustees and headquarters were overly distressed about the movie, so much so that they failed to recognize AA's action went against their own principle of avoiding public controversy. That issue underscored Bill's concern that the trustees and headquarters by themselves could cause significant harm, which would ultimately alienate the membership. Bill believed if groups were accountable for AA's decisions, then the fellowship would be responsible for its stumbles and successes. Today, AA groups are responsible for AA's missteps. So Bill's fundamental question when all of this was going on, can AA unity usher the fellowship through any difficulties relating the world outside to each other? This proved true when the very name of Alcoholics Anonymous was threatened. In a cause to save AA's name from misuse, Bernard Smith, a trustee, came up with the idea of obtaining a congressional charter for Alcoholics Anonymous, which would put it on a par with the Red Cross. Well, congressional oversight? It seemed like a good idea at the time. But then the conference was in place and the delegates met to review those recommendations. And in their conference advisory actions in 1953, the delegates said, "The evils that have caused the question to rise have largely abated. In other words, these things will come and go. They usually will just go away." 2, a congressional incorporation would create by law power to govern which would be contrary to and violative of our traditions. 3, it would implement the spiritual force of AA with a legal power, which we believe would tend to weaken its spiritual strength. There is so much depth in that recommendation. They go on to say, when we ask for legal rights enforceable in a courts of law, we, by the same act, subject ourselves to possible legal regulation. I mean, we end up in court without legal regulation. 5, we might well become endlessly entangled in litigation, which together with the incidental expense and publicity could seriously threaten our very existence. 6, incorporation of AA could conceivably become an opening wedge that might engender politics and a struggle for power within our own ranks. 7, Continuously since its beginning and today, AA has been a fellowship, not an organization. Incorporation necessarily makes it an organization. 8, we believe that spiritual faith and a way of life cannot be incorporated. And finally, the delegates said, AA can and will survive so long as it remains a spiritual faith and a way of life open to all men and women who suffer from alcoholism. They recommended against the charter, and their reasons were a spiritual force. For Bill, this was a perfect example of why the conference structure was essential to AA's survival. The conference thought we ought to forget about the questionable advantages of legality and controversy and rely upon group and public opinion for our ultimate protection. After long debate, we at headquarters saw that the conscience of Alcoholics Anonymous acting through the delegates was wiser than we were. It was through the wisdom of the conference that attraction prevailed over force. Now, at the personal level, Bill's opinions on outside issues, well, he was able to step back because he had succeeded in securing majority representation for alcoholics on the board. He felt like he was free to pursue his own interests. Ernest Kurtz reminds us that Bill's main efforts outside of AA in the final 15 years of his life were attempts to remove the mental or psychological and physical obstacles that impeded some persons from openness to the spiritual. Among Bill's many pursuits were 3 that generated historical distortions in their telling and retelling even today, and that is spiritualism, LSD, and the vitamins B3 and niacin. Bill's personal opinions on spiritualism. Kurtz wrote that Bill's conviction that he had incontrovertible and personal evidence of individual human conscious life lasting beyond physical death profoundly influenced Bill's adult faith, at least from the mid-1940s on. Bill experimented with and eventually claimed some power over spiritualistic phenomenon. Bill believed he had evidence of the existence of a higher power, yet he deliberately avoided sharing his conviction with the fellowship, much to the relief of the trustees. Bill only guardedly shared his insights with a few close friends, believing that faith required for salvation from alcoholism had to be just that, faith. He kept his opinions on religion to himself. In the matter of LSD, in 1954, 2 psychiatrists, Drs. Hoffer and Osmond, contacted Bill and claimed that their work with LSD and schizophrenia might help alcoholics with delirium tremens. At first, Bill was not enthusiastic at all, but after reviewing their research and seeing some positive results, he took the drug under the guidance and presence of a psychiatrist at the Los Angeles Veterans Administration Hospital in August 1956. Bill, driven by his belief in spiritualism and by a desire to find a similar experience that would help struggling alcoholics find a God of their own understanding, thought that LSD held some promise. He even asked some of his closest associates to try the drug, including Father Ed Dowling and Lois. Well, predictably, when the word reached the fellowship, there was substantial opposition. Bill thought that this could be helpful to alcoholics, and furthermore, he bitterly resented being told by the fellowship how to live his life when he was making every effort to back away from the leadership of AA. You hear that threat of immaturity. The LSD experiment's ensuing controversy happened to overlap with Bill's ongoing argument with Tebow about his own immaturity. As a result, Bill reluctantly withdrew from the LSD experiments in 1959, acknowledging that he could never escape his status as founder of AA. Soon after his withdrawal from the experiment, the government terminated the research, and shortly after that, LSD was declared illegal. Bill shared his personal opinions on B3 and niacin, however. Now remember, Bill suffered from debilitating depression. Well, he tried vitamins B3 and niacin and was convinced that they were a breakthrough treatment for depression and could help dually diagnosed alcoholics. He began enthusiastically working with researchers in the field. And he wrote about B3 and niacin using AA letterhead in the General Service Office. And to make matters worse, Bill started freely sharing the vitamins with the staff at GSO and with alcoholics in meetings. Here, my friend, here's a couple. Here, you can have some. Take them, they're free. Bill was certainly entitled to engage in this research, but the trustees decided to take measures to stop him from pursuing this interest under the auspices of AA. At the very start of its transition to a majority of alcoholic trustees, the board issued a report that included a recommendation that Bill separate his non-AA matters from AA using his own letterhead and his own personal address rather than that of GSO. Furthermore, the board recommended that Bill not involve GSO employees in activities not related to AA, please. The 1967 conference supported the board's recommendation, and Bill complied. However, he did continue his research and writing on B3 and niacin up until shortly before he died. What I love about this story is that oddly Bill broke his own traditions, but the traditions in his hard-fought-for conference and general service structure saved AA from Bill. Whether or not he appreciated it at the time, his dream was a working reality. At the very public level, AA has been called in for congressional testimony. We were called in twice, 2 occasions, to present at hearings, and one has to think that such heady and public environments by nature could be tempting for grandstanding alcoholics to hold forth. Fortunately, the committee reports from these 2 sessions provide a model on how AA's trusted servants practiced restraint and honored the 10th tradition. Bill spoke about the history of AA, and he was referred to in the documentation as Bill W. before the U.S. Senate Special Subcommittee on Alcoholism and Narcotics of the Committee on Labor and Public Welfare in July 1969. Later, in 1988, non-alcoholic trustee Dr. Joan Jackson, she could use her last name, testified before the Committee on Governmental Affairs. Dr. Jackson was asked to discuss the AA philosophy of treatment of alcohol abuse and to describe the AA program. After her testimony, the committee asked a number of questions. I'm providing a snapshot of some of Dr. Jackson's responses, which demonstrate the simple practice of the 10th tradition. She said, "We do not take a position on this question." And then she said, AA would not consider it to be appropriate to comment on the studies cited by name that doctor. And then she said again, when they kept repeating some questions, as stated above, Alcoholics Anonymous does not have an opinion on other forms of treatment for alcoholism or about their effectiveness. I'm not going to change my answer. The AA group pamphlet gives a list of 10 items that AA members do not do, or what does AA not do. And in that list, they say we do not recruit members or furnish initial motivation for alcoholics to recover. We don't keep membership records. We don't follow up or try to control our members. We don't make medical psychological diagnoses or prognoses, and we don't provide hospitalization, drugs, or medical or psychiatric treatment. We don't provide housing, food, clothing, jobs, money, or other such services. And we don't provide domestic or vocational counseling. We stay out of those professional areas. We don't engage in or sponsor research, and we don't affiliate with social agencies, although to be clear, many members and service offices do cooperate with them. We don't offer religious services, and we don't engage in any matters, any controversy about alcohol or other matters. We don't accept money for our services or contributions from non-AA sources. And finally, the last one, we don't provide letters of reference to parole boards, attorneys, court officials, schools, businesses, social agencies, or any other institution. Now, certainly, members can provide letters of reference or recommendation. AA simply asks that they don't affiliate their recommendation with Alcoholics Anonymous, that they don't identify themselves as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous to avoid that implied affiliation. In summary, Bill referred to AA's experiences with outside opinions as only short-term disruptions that in essence had nothing to do with one alcoholic talking to another. Thus, at this point in our study of the traditions, it might seem outright laughable when Bill wrote in his essay on the 10th tradition, "Never since it began has Alcoholics Anonymous been divided by a major controversial issue." I mean, goodness sakes, every tradition was born out of controversy within the fellowship, mostly of its own making, and always accompanied by a roar of angry members. But it is true what Bill said, that despite their den and our puny roles, never did AA a particle of harm. They were just part and parcel of learning to live and work together. I hope that this journey through the traditions has demonstrated what Bill said was true, that whatever we try to do, we're usually always concerned with ways to make AA more effective, how to do the most good for the most alcoholics. Coming up, the 11th tradition. Given that we see the importance of avoiding public controversy, it is not surprising that the next tradition discusses anonymity at the level of press, radio, and film. For comments and questions, or if you want to be on the mailing list, please contact me at whatslenderthreads@gmail.com. For other resources and workshop flyers, see www.onwhatslenderthreads.com. And thank you.